Space, the final frontier. These were the words first uttered by Gene Roddenberry in 1966 with the first episode of Star Trek, the original series. Since then, it has been the dream of many boys and girls to travel to planets in our solar system and to explore the far reaches of space. In this video, we will take a look at the growing industry that is space tourism and how this industry relates to other forms of tourism such as ecotourism and agritourism. We will look at whether space tourism is a form of sustainable tourism, and finally, why many consider this to be part of the elite tourism realm, all while trying to explain why tourists are boldly going where so few have gone before. Hello, and welcome to a very special edition of the Pirate Archaeologist. You all know me. I am your host, the Pirate Archaeologist himself, Christopher Dean Blosser. However, for this spacey edition, I am not just a normal pirate archaeologist. I will be, in fact, the Space Pirate Archaeologist. Now let us begin on the journey that is space tourism. Since the dawn of aviation, people have been looking toward the future and asking, what is next? In the 1960s, the space race between the United States and the USSR took the idea of leaving Earth and flying with the birds, according to Weber, to a new level by venturing into and sending the first humans into space. Even though they were tourists in the loosest form of the word, they were not considered tourists. They were, however, pioneers in an industry that has more recently exploded onto the scene. Space tourism, you could say, started with the first crewed flight, but even more so with the first footsteps on a rock that was not the Earth, like the Moon. The moon landing happened a mere 66 years after the Wright brothers took that first flight at Kitty Hawk, and, according to Smith, technically made Neil Armstrong the first human space tourist, something many right now are trying to emulate. While it is true that any astronaut or cosmonaut who travels to the International Space Station can be considered tourists to space, they are not civilians. They did not pay for the opportunity to see this new frontier. They are professionals who live and work in space, providing the rest of us with the knowledge to continue to work toward the future of space exploration. But what makes space tourism appealing? And for that matter, what is space tourism? Well, let us discuss what makes space. First, the beginning reaches of space starts with what is known as the Kármán line. Now, there are discrepancies as to where this line actually begins, but because it is an imaginary and arbitrary line, many believe that it begins 62 miles above the surface of the Earth, in line with what the French Fédération Aéronautique Internationale defines as suborbital, as discussed by Smith. Space tourism is not just suborbital flights, where one takes off in a rocket and hits the Kármán line and then gently lands back to Earth, as in the case of Jeff Bezos and his Blue Origin rocket. In fact, according to Henderson, Swee, and Crouch, there are 4 distinct categories of space tourism: high-altitude jet fighter flights, atmospheric zero-gravity flights, also known as the Vomit Comet, of course, the short-duration suborbital flight, and finally, the longer-duration orbital trips into space and on board the space station. There are, of course, new types of trips that would certainly fall into new categories, such as high-altitude balloon flights. And with the introduction of Galaxy's Edge at Disney World, there is now a virtual component to space tourism, where tourists can experience space without ever leaving Earth. Now, you may be wondering, How, if there are no international boundaries, no native populations, and no regulations, as Gornik mentioned in the lecture, how does space tourism relate to eco and agritourism, as well as other forms of adventure tourism? Well, it's quite simple. It is part of a growing trend of tourism ideas that include newer and unique experiences. Even some adventure tourism, such as underwater tourism, fall into this category. Underwater tourism, as described by Lemaine Wolfrey, offers travelers a chance to see the marine world, not just looking at the world from above and participating in research experiments, as one does with the current forms of long-duration trips to the International Space Station. Although some underwater tourism has that same component. For example, if you travel to Challenger Deep, the deepest point in the ocean, you are required to participate in research. While each form of tourism in this category has their own unique sets of ideals, the premise is the same: cultural awareness and better living, both on and now off the planet. That is, if Elon Musk has anything to say on humankind becoming a multiplanetary species. These forms of tourism are usually self-sustainable, but let us discuss sustainability as it relates to space tourism. Space tourism is not what you would consider a self-sustainable industry in the traditional sense. Space tourism does not strictly follow the principles laid out for us by the ecotourism.org What is Ecotourism article. What makes space tourism sustainable is the influx of money from investors, which we will discuss later, as well as the interest generated by the adventure tourist. However, Peters has a different theory on if space tourism can be sustainable. His theory is that the environmental impacts of launching between 100 and 1,000 rockets a year, when space tourism finally becomes inexpensive enough to become a crown jewel in pro-consumerism tourism, will pose a greater responsibility to the few who are able to partake in this activity, and may ultimately lead to a sixth extinction. The problem is not enough people want to talk about the impacts that space tourism has on not only the environment, but on the human population itself. As I mentioned in the narration, many boys and girls have dreamed of going into space, dreamed of exploring distant planets and possibly other galaxies. Now, I know interstellar travel is a long way away, but the dreams are out there. However, according to sources, whether it's Cobb, Chang, discussing Dennis Tito as the first commercial astronaut and tourist to the International Space Station, or Billings, Loiseau, Margolis, and Kamen discussing the commerciality of space travel, as it all comes down to one thing: money. Money is what makes this form of adventure tourism so elite. Dennis Tito bought his ticket on the Russian Soyuz rocket for his 10-day stay on the International Space Station, at which he paid $20 million for. And that was in 2001. When Jeff Bezos launched his first Blue Origin's rocket with its first passengers, the going price at auction was $55 million a ticket. Richard Branson has not disclosed what it cost to send a Virgin Galactic crew into suborbital space, but he is adamant about keeping civilian tickets at a cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 to $250,000. Comparatively speaking, the first flight from SpaceX, with the Inspiration 4 crew, cost $250 million in total, although that number is deceptive. Jared Isaacman put up the first $100 million for his seat, with the express request that that money, and all other monies collected, be donated to St. Jude's. You see, the last 3 seats on the SpaceX rocket were given away to contest winners, and the only rule in that contest was you had to donate money to St. Jude's. Any amount of donation was considered entry for the contest drawing. Nonetheless, it will not be until companies start building space hotels, space cruise ships like the Fhloston Paradise we saw in the movie The Fifth Element, or even bases on the Moon and Mars, that space tourism will become a viable economic option for tourism. Even then, the disparity between the rich and the poor will be great. The options and types of activities you can participate in will be limited to what you can afford. Even now, adventure tourism is not cheap. Those high-flying fighter jet experiences can cost anywhere between $14,000 to $47,000, depending on the aircraft you're flying in. So it is no wonder people are looking to other destinations first. Other destinations that may offer the same sort of otherworldly experiences. For example, I mentioned Disney's Galaxy's Edge before. But at Epcot Center, there is Mission to Space and the Space 220 restaurant, which gives you an opportunity to see space without leaving Earth at a cost in the hundreds instead of thousands of dollars. I believe that in the future, with better technologies and more destinations, space tourism will boom, and the inequality gap between elite and standard tourism will become indistinguishable from one another. I do hope that this edition was informative for you. And as always, I thank you for watching, and I leave you with this missive. When it comes to knowledge, take what you can, give nothing back. Unless, of course, it is to educate others. With that, I am your host, Christopher Dean Blosser, and I am the Pirate Archaeologist, signing off.